of all, Dr. John Childs, pleasure to have you here. Wonderful to see you this morning. John, do you mind before we get rolling? Can you just kind of give, for those who might not be familiar with you, can you just give a little background, kind of even before the idea of South College started, kind of what brought you up to that point, and then we're going to dive into that origin story.
Yeah, you bet. Well, first of all, Jeff, it's great to reconnect. It's like
Yeah.
long time no see, and really good to be with you. Yeah, it's a long story, right? As is any sort of journey. So I'll try to be relatively brief. EIM really was born originally, call it 2003, 2004, with a real focus in postgraduate education. If you ask, most therapists on the street, sort of who EIM was back in the day, it was really blended, hybrid, postgraduate residency, certification, fellowship, programs, working with a lot of employers around the country who, really viewed sponsoring students through EIM programs as a way to recruit and retain, the best therapists. And so we developed relationships with a lot of employers as well as individual therapists, hosting weekend courses. But really, the mission, if you will, was to develop longer term certification residency type programs, because that's really the kind of education that can actually impact your decision making. I mean, I think we all know that just going to a weekend course alone, that's great, but wow, connecting, the dots, so to speak, in a lifelong journey is really the way to learn and the way to impact your practice. So that was sort of the mission. And then, fast forward to 2011, 2012, really that was at least my own recollection of when there was a lot of discussion around the looming problem of student debt. And our view was that, maybe there was an opportunity to do something different in entry level or pre-professional education. And so that's really where the idea of a hybrid accelerated 2-year program really started to germinate, if you will.
And were those the primary things, John? So when you looked at DPT education, were those the primary things that you thought we can make this better? Was it the condensed making it shorter, right? So condensing the material. What other things were you looking at as far as whether it was clinical education or the actual coursework and the programs? Was there a whole list of things that you all were like, look, this could all be significantly better?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jeff. The idea really started with clinical education, and I'll back up just a bit. And I'm sort of embarrassed to admit this now, but we never really intended to get into DPT education. The original idea was to form what we called at the time a clinical excellence network. We had developed a lot of relationships with a number of employers around the country in our post-professional side of the business. And we knew that it was difficult to place students into clinical sites. And so we thought, as a good faith gesture to DPT programs, we had access to a lot of clinical sites. So we put all these sort of clinical sites together, and we basically emailed every DCE in the country and said, hey, we'd love to work with you. This doesn't cost you anything. We know it's hard to place students in sites. How can we sort of work together? And sort of the idea for us was, it was kind of a way to get in front of students so that, we could develop a relationship with them, and, maybe ultimately, maybe they eventually go on to a post-professional program. And if we know them in their clinical education, we can sort of help connect the dots for them.
Sure.
And so we put this network together, and it was like crickets. I mean, it's amazing that, like, wow, this was free. Like, we thought we were being helpful, but apparently that was not viewed as being helpful. And everyone's very territorial. I think there was sort of this impression that if you're the DCE and all of a sudden we're going to now maybe assist you in placing clinical students at clinical sites, maybe your position becomes irrelevant, right? It sort of threatens maybe your significance, if you will. And we just didn't anticipate that. And so that's really where it started. That concept was a total flop. And so what we really thought was, wow, if we really want to influence clinical education, because here the other part of the rationale was clinical education has not changed in 50 years. You know, when we moved to the DPT, we really elevated the didactic curriculum. You know, we added, you know, primary care and imaging and pharmacology, you know, the kinds of content that makes it a DPT, but clinical education didn't get touched at all. It was still done in this, you know, very disparate, all schools have different models of these short 6, 8, you know, 10, 12 weeks. Maybe there's 3 rotations, maybe there's 4 rotations. And we really felt like that clinical education ought to be longer. You know, it ought to be a minimum, for example, of a 6-month internship, maybe as long as a year-long internship, but really consistency, maybe even incorporating some element of didactics into clinical education, make it look and feel more like, you know, sort of residency, if you will. And then I think the other piece of it is our view was, look, students in clinical practices pose all sorts of kind of unintended consequences for employers, primarily that they can't bill for their services. So sort of our view was, let's think about clinical education being as long as possible in one rotation, maybe somewhere of 5 to 6 months long, and then let's get them graduated and get them licensed. Now they're really useful to employers, and then continue their education in postgraduate residency. So it's more like medicine. When you graduate as a physician, you're not really competent to practice, right? You sort of have to go on to residency. And certainly in PT, you have to be competent to practice because of the CAPTE standards, but it's a minimum standard. So that's really where a lot of this concept sort of came from. We just realized that by partnering with schools, we were never going to be able to sort of influence clinical education in any significant way. So that's really when the thought started coming of, let's just build our own model from the ground up.
Yeah. Yeah. So here we are at this point then. So we've got this idea of making it more accelerated, which is a huge blow to student debt in a very positive way. We've got the idea of enhancing clinical education. So you're thinking of some things that you want to do to make this different. And now knowing you've probably got to do it, at least in some part by yourself. My next question is, how's South College?